If you think color grading is just orange and teal, you're limiting yourself. This time, we focus entirely on the aesthetics. We're going to break down and recreate different film-inspired looks inside DaVinci Resolve, so you can start building your own signature looks instead of copying everyone else's. All of this was shot during the first weekend of spring in Lund, Sweden. And if you want to color grade along with me in real time, leave a comment below and I'll share the original footage. In order to make your digital footage look filmic, we must first break down the characteristics of film. Film is not just a color palette or a film grain overlay. Film is a behavior. Highlights roll off more gently, colors feel more cohesive, saturation is richer but more controlled, combined with analog imperfections such as halation, glow, and film grain. These behaviors are what give film its organic character. And this is important. Building a convincing film look is really the result of many small decisions working together. Tonal shaping, color distribution, color toning, saturation behavior, texture, and final polish. So now, let's manually create several Kodak and Fuji-inspired looks. Then, we'll explore batch grading, because film isn't just one frame, it's consistency across the entire project. Before we start designing a look, we must first prepare the image properly. Now this video is mainly focused on aesthetics and color design, so we'll just move through the correction stage fairly quickly. If you're an absolute beginner, just follow along for now. I'll link my previous workflow videos below where I go much deeper in color correction. I first normalized the footage using color space transform. My workflow is pretty simple. I transform the footage into DaVinci wide gamut for grading, then transform it back into Rec 709 for YouTube delivery. This part is fairly standard, but there are two creative decisions I want to point out. For tone mapping, I'm choosing simple instead of DaVinci, a little more analog. And I also have saturation compression enabled. We'll come back to this later once we start shaping colors. Let's bring back some shape and depth. Using the HDR wheels, I gently bring down light to recover some depth in the midtones. Lower shadow slightly. Then lift highlight to bring back some of the soft glow from the wall behind him. Look at it before and after. The image already starts gaining more shape. This footage was already white balanced on location, so we're good to go. Finally, I add a bit of contrast to give the image more shape. And now we have a clean, neutral starting point ready for creative grading. Just remember that color grading is mostly meaningless when you don't know what you're trying to say through colors. So for this scene, let's say we want to capture the feeling of a warm spring morning. I want to recreate a look inspired by Kodak Gold 200. Kodak Gold is known for its warm tones, rich colors, and flattering skin tones, which fits perfectly with the feeling we're going for here. Create a new note after your correction section and open the RGB mixer. This technique is called RGB Crosstalk. And don't worry if this feels confusing at first. The important thing is to watch how the overall color palette changes. We're going to gently compress the palette into those Kodak warmer hues. Make sure Preserve Luminance is enabled so we don't shift the brightness of the image. And enable Auto Normalize throughout this process to keep the white balance stable. Now watch what happens. In the red output, I slightly increase green. This pushes red away from magenta and toward orange, which helps skin tone feel warmer and more natural. Then in the green output, I mix in a touch of red and blue to warm up the greens and shift the overall palette into Kodak's warmer color. Finally, in the blue output, I add some green and reduce red to soften the blues and make the palette feel more cohesive. The shift is actually very subtle, but if you look at the factor scope, the colors now sit closer together instead of being stretched. And of course, you can push this technique much further if you want a more stylized look. But for this project, I want to keep things relatively natural. Now, let's shape the overall tone of the image. I like to use film packaging as a loose visual reference, so we'll use that as inspiration for our look. Create a new note after the RGB mixer. If you're using the free version, you can simply push the gamma wheel slightly toward gold in the primaries panel. But if you have the studio version, I prefer using chromatic adaptation for this. I shot this at 5600 Kelvin, but I want the image to feel warmer and slightly more nostalgic. So I lower the target's color temperature and add just a touch of magenta tint. The image immediately starts leaning into that Kodak warmth. Next, I want to introduce a subtle magenta tint into the shadows. Create another note and go to the lock wheels. Push the shadows wheel slightly towards magenta, then soften the transition using the lower range control. At first, the shadows might look slightly dirty or exaggerated. We'll clean this up later during the polish stage. Now that the overall look is established, we can start refining the image. This is where small refinements start making a surprisingly big difference. Sometimes I'll slightly shift certain hues or adjust the intensity of certain colors using tools like color slides or curves. Nothing dramatic, just small refinements to make the palette feel more unified. But one of the biggest things that helps digital footage feel less digital is saturation compression. When highly saturated colors get pushed into a smaller color space like Rec. 709, they often clip into harsh blocks of neon color. Saturation compression helps smooth out those transitions. The easiest method is enabling saturation compression directly inside Color Space Transform. Next, I like using luminosity versus saturation to gently reduce saturation in the shadows and highlights. This helps clean up the image while allowing the midtones to feel richer and more layered. Finally, we can shape the tonal roll-off using soft clip. If you followed my channel for a while, you already know I prefer richer shadows over heavily faded blacks. For this look, I'm keeping it subtle. From here, you can push the look even further with texture tools such as glow, halation, and film grain. And this is really the core idea behind building your own film look. Not one magic adjustment, but many small decisions working together. And now that we understand the behavior behind the look, let's push it in another direction. This next look is inspired by Kodak UltraMax 400. Compared to Kodak Gold, UltraMax tends to feel slightly more balanced, with stronger blues and greens while still retaining Kodak's characteristic warmth. And this time, we don't have to start from scratch. The image is already color corrected, and we can reuse most of the RGB crosstalk settings from the previous look. I only make a few small adjustments to push the yellows a little further and maintain a better balance between the warm brick walls and blue sky. This time, I'm also skipping chromatic adaptation because I want to preserve some of the natural daylight neutrality in the image. Instead, I introduce a subtle cerulean tint into the shadows, then use color slides to increase the density and saturation of the yellows. After that, it's the same polishing process: luminosity versus saturation for cleaner tonal separation, soft clip for gentle roll-off, then texture tools such as halation, glow, and film grain. Notice how the workflow barely changed, yet building different looks suddenly becomes much less mysterious. So now that we've explored Kodak's warmer palette, let's move in a completely different direction: Fuji. Fujifilm stocks are often associated with cooler, cleaner greens and a more neutral overall balance. Since it's the first week of spring, this time I want the greens to become the main character. This look is inspired by Fujichrome Provia 100F, which is known for its natural color reproduction, balanced saturation, and deep, rich blacks. This image is already color corrected, so once again we can focus mostly on palette shaping. This time, I want to shift the palette away from Kodak's golden warmth and push the image towards Fuji's cooler emerald greens. Start with the red output and enable auto normalize. I pull down greens slightly to remove some of the yellow from the skin tones and shift them towards Fuji's cleaner pink-red balance. Then in the green output, I boost red and lower blue to cool down the greens and push the foliage toward that fresh Fuji signature color. To rebalance the palette, I go into the blue output and make a few small adjustments to compress the colors back together. Don't get too attached to exact numbers here. The factor scope is here to guide your overall color distribution, not to give you fixed settings to memorize. Now the image still feels slightly warm to me, so I use chromatic adaptation to cool the image down and restore a cleaner neutral balance. And unlike the Kodak look, I'm intentionally avoiding additional color toning here because I want the image to feel fresh and natural. Finally, I slightly deepen the yellow-green density to give the foliage a little more richness, then apply the same polishing process and texture refinements from earlier. Now the image feels fresh, airy, clean, and very distinctly Fuji. We now walk over to the city park to join the bonfire to welcome the arrival of spring. This look is inspired by Fuji's Superia Extra 400, which is known for its vivid colors, punchy contrast, and subtle magenta undertones in the shadows. This image is already color corrected, so once again we can reuse most of the previous Fuji palette's shaping. This time, I warm up the image slightly using chromatic adaptation. Then I introduce a subtle magenta tint into the shadows. And interestingly, the image starts leaning slightly sweeter and more nostalgic. The fire itself still feels a little too harsh to me, so I increase the yellow-orange density to bring back more richness and energy into the flames. After that, it's the same polishing process. Luminosity versus saturation, soft clip, and texture refinements. And once you become familiar with these small adjustments, building your own signature looks starts becoming surprisingly flexible. Before we move on to batch grading, I want to quickly show you a few more stylistic variations. Sometimes, removing color entirely can actually make an image feel even more emotional. For black and white images, I prefer enabling monochrome directly inside the RGB mixer. This allows me to control how bright different color channels appear in black and white, which gives much more control over contrast and tonal separation. And black and white images are powerful for a reason. Once color disappears, the eye naturally starts paying attention to light, shadow, texture, shape, and emotion. The image starts feeling more timeless. We can also push this further into sepia tones for memories, flashbacks, or dreamlike sequences. I simply warm the image using the gamma wheel until the monochrome image starts leaning into that faded brown tone. Now, what if we intentionally move away from clean and polished altogether? Vintage looks are interesting because they often work by carefully introducing imperfections back into the image. Things like faded blacks, compressed highlights, shifted colors, reduced saturation, and uneven color separation. In other words, we start breaking some of the rules we've been following so far. For this look, I first borrowed the Kodak palette we created earlier. Then, I use another RGB mixer to reduce saturation more organically across the color channels, almost like simulating chemical aging. For example, if I want to reduce the overall saturation by roughly 20%, I'll set the red, green, and blue channel outputs to around 0.8. The image immediately starts looking older, softer, and less digitally clean. Next, I cool the image slightly using chromatic adaptation, then push the color shifts further. Magenta in the shadows, green, yellow in the highlight, just like aging film prints often develop over time. And unlike earlier examples, I actually leave some of the shadow and highlight saturation slightly dirty instead of perfectly cleaned up. Then in soft clip, I heavily fade the blacks and compress the highlights to flatten the image and soften the modern digital contrast. And this is what makes understanding color behavior so powerful. Once you understand the rules, you can start breaking them intentionally. Last but not least, this warm and cozy cafe is about to become cold, harsh, and dramatic using a classic cinematic process called Bleach Bypass. We retain the Kodak palette, but cool down the image using chromatic adaptation and introduce a subtle indigo tint into the shadows to create a heavier mood. Now we apply the actual Bleach Bypass effect. Create a layer node and change the composite mode to overlay. Then in the lower layer, go into the RGB mixer and enable monochrome. This essentially fuses a monochrome image back onto the original color image, which immediately creates a much harsher contrast response. To recover some detail in the highlights and shadows, I use custom curves with editable splines enabled. Lowering the overall pivot slightly pushes the image toward a darker, heavier atmosphere. And if the image still feels too colorful, in the upper layer, I selectively reduce the warmer hues like reds, skin tones, and yellows to strip away some of the remaining warmth. After the usual polishing process, the transformation becomes much more dramatic. And hopefully by now, you can see that color grading is not just about applying a so-called cinematic look. It's about shaping emotional atmosphere. There's an entire spectrum of visual possibilities available to you far beyond the usual orange and teal formula. But building one beautiful frame is only half the challenge. The real challenge is consistency, making multiple shots feel like they belong in the same world. And this is where batch grading becomes incredibly powerful. First, put all the relevant clips in the same group. Some things usually stay constant across a scene. Your color space transforms, your palette shaping, your polishing, your texture. And then you have a smaller set of variables, mainly exposure, white balance, and small shot-to-shot refinements. And this is why group pre-clip and group post-clip becomes so powerful. Everything shared across the sequence can live inside the group structure. And suddenly, the entire workflow becomes much cleaner and more focused. Now, personally, there are two things I pay the most attention to when matching shots: light distribution and color temperature, because even subtle inconsistencies in brightness or color temperature can break the illusion that shots belong together. For exposure consistency, I highly recommend using false color at the very end of the pipeline. It removes a lot of the blind guessing and helps keep your tonal balance much more unified across shots. And for color temperature, tools like chromatic adaptation becomes incredibly useful for keeping every scene inside the same visual world. But if you only have the free version, you can still refer to your parade and vector scope to check the alignment between shots. Color grading is not about chasing looks, it's about building a world. Got questions? Or if you want the free footage, just let me know below.